As I like to do with most of my opening series and repertoires, at the beginning I like to cover the unusual replies to an opening, and immediately here after move 2, Black has a whole host of different options at his disposal. The main lines such as knight e4 or d5 or e6 will be covered later on in this series, but for now I'd like to concentrate on those moves which are played less frequently. Some are playable. I would say that some are probably a bit risky from Black's point of view, but either way it's worth having a look at them just so that if you do face them on the odd chance you are well booked. So let's have a look. After bishop g5, well, the first move I'd like to cover very quickly is move h6. Now, this is obviously asking white to take on f6, and after e takes f6, here white can play either e3 or even g3 to stop black fianchettoing his bishop. And what we're going to get is we're going to get a very similar plan structure to the positions that arise after either 2d5 or 2g6. So keep your eyes out for those chapters because you'll get a good idea of what's going on. In fact, h6 I would be quite happy to give it a dubious annotation, because in those other chapters with 2d5 and 2g6 you've got this move h6 inserted, which is not only a waste of tempo, but it weakens the g6 square, which could become important. You'll see this a bit later on, but h6 is something we shouldn't be worried about. Have a look at those chapters to know what you should be doing in your setup with white. All right, so another move here that we have to consider is the move knight c6 on move 2. It's actually a speciality of an English player by the name of Stephen Gregory, and I actually faced this line once in my life against Stephen in the year 2002 in the British Championships, and I think the way I played it is certainly something I'm willing to recommend to all of you guys. There are clearly a lot of moves after knight c6, but I like the move knight c3. It's logical. You're preparing to expand in the centre with e4 and get a decent game. Here, black has got a few options. He can play the move that Stephen did in the game, e5, which is really the reason behind knight c6 to play e5. He can play d5, but this is a bit of a weird Veresov. Actually, we could get to this position via a Veresov move order. But with the move knight c6, it feels very, very odd here indeed. And well, white's got a whole host of ways of playing here. He can just play e3. He's always threatening to take on f6. In fact, he might even be able to take on f6 straight away. And for example, if e takes f6, e3. And one of the big plans here is to really put a lot of pressure on this pawn on d5. You can do that via queen f3, bishop b5, and then knight g2, knight f4 would be the first setup that would come to mind. But I think actually after d5, it's almost a novelty position, so it's very unlikely you're going to get that. But if not d5, also e6 is an option. But again, this feels a bit weird because after e4, well, if d5 in this position, e5, h6, what we actually get after either bishop d2 or bishop e3 is a McCutcheon variation of the French defense, but with the move knight c6, which makes absolutely no sense because the whole point of the French McCutcheon is that black gets counterplay via c5, and you can't do that with the knight on c6. So after bishop e3, you know, this is a great position for white. So that's not really to be recommended. So Stephen's idea with knight c6 after knight c3 is to play e5, and here I like what I played against him, and that is the move d5. And after knight e7, I also like my next move. Here, black would love to be able to play knight g6 very quickly and clear his lines, but d6 is a good move. And the point is that after c takes d6, we're not taking back with the queen, which would then allow knight g6, but we're going to play the move e4 and play a positional binding setup against the d5 square and the f5 square. And notice how here black's position, well, it doesn't look great. Yes, he's a pawn up, but you don't really feel it. White, on the other hand, is going to be putting his bishop on c4, controlling d5. It's got very fluid development. So, for example, if knight c6, here I actually played bishop takes f6 against Stephen, which is a bit inaccurate. I should have just played knight f3, and after bishop e7, you can just take on f6. And whichever way he takes, let's say g takes f6 to cover the pawn on d6, bishop c4, it's just an absolute dream. This is almost a Sveshnikov gone completely wrong. The double d-pawns are a huge drawback for black because this bishop is stuck, this bishop is stuck, you've got squares on f5, it's just a total dream for white. So I think that's the way to play against it. And well, okay, if bishop takes f6 again, don't have to take the pawn on d6 at all, just play bishop c4, knight d5, c3. It's just so difficult for black to get out. This is a nice advantage for white. So I wouldn't be too scared about the move knight c6 whatsoever. The next line that I'd like to cover here is the move b6. Now this is quite an interesting move. Black looks to fianchetto the bishop ASAP, and it's interesting because, well, white has got a number of moves here again he can play. Of course he can take on f6 here, that would be one way to play it. And if e takes f6, e3 or e4 come to mind. However, even though this is fine, I actually like the move that a good friend of mine and the author of the excellent Playing the Trompowsky, International Master Richard Pert, who produced a fabulous work very recently on this opening. He recommends the move knight d2, and I actually like it. It's not a bad move at all. It's a flexible move. c4 is another move here, but this is then verging into Queen's Indian territory, and it's not really in the spirit of this opening. If you're playing the Trompowsky, normally it's because you're not so well versed, or perhaps not really looking to get a more principled line like the Queen's Indian. So the move knight d2 I actually really like. And after bishop b7, again, we've got this option of taking on f6, but knight gf3 is absolutely fine as well. And it's not so easy for black to get developed here. For example, after e6, well, now we can play e4 in one go thanks to the pin on the knight. And after h6, we can take on f6 and play bishop d3, and we get a position which resembles the two e6 line. So remember to check that out in this series. But black has fianchettoed his bishop, which you don't really see so much in that line. And I think the reason is because white gets a really strong initiative in the center. So here, for example, after d6, queen e2, as pointed out by Pert, is very strong indeed, and I tend to agree with him, because now e5 or d5, pushing forward with these pawns in the center, is actually quite difficult to deal with. For example, if the queen retreats, you can play a4 with white first, looking to play a5, very, very typical way to play, gaining space on the queen side. Black traditionally replies a6 to meet a5 with b5, and after castles, bishop e7, now d5, excellent move suggested by Pert. I really like it, actually. We see one of the drawbacks of this bishop going to b7 is that after this move, and with the inclusion of h6 in this particular line, black's light squares on the king side can become really vulnerable and targets. So, for example, if you take on d5, you can just take back, and after bishop takes d5, black has won a pawn, but after rook f e1, the initiative is just very unpleasant to deal with if you're black. You've got ideas of knight h4, you've got ideas of queen h5, of course, rook f e1 stops black from castling immediately. There are always problems getting your pieces out here. It really is unpleasant, and I think over the board, this is a nightmare situation for black to deal with. So this idea of knight d2 against b6 I actually quite like. You could go on move 4, d5 here. That might not be such a bad move. When we get into standard kind of Touré attack territory, but white can play e3, e6, and here you can even play knight e5 if you're white, with the idea of meeting either bishop d6 with f4, or if bishop e7, you can even throw in a check. I quite like this check. See it in a lot of openings, provoking black to play c6. If knight fd7, maybe you can just drop back with the bishop on f4. That looks fine for white. Or if you play c6, you drop the bishop back. And rather than going bishop d3 straight away, you've actually blocked this diagonal for the bishop. So black's traditional counter of knight e4 is a bit more difficult. And after castles, knight bd7, something like f4. And yeah, we've got a good position here with white. c3, queen f3, queen h3. These kind of ideas are actually very dangerous. So I quite like that suggestion to play knight d2 against b6. All right, what else have we got? Well, we've got the move also here, c6, which is a very funny move. Doesn't look entirely logical at all, does it? You don't really threaten anything in the center. You deprive your knight of the c6 square. Doesn't really feel like it does much, but actually it prepares a queen sortie very early on, because now that this pawn is weak, sometimes that can be a target. But also it's amazing in how many games this has happened, that after the standard looking move e3 by white, queen a5 check actually wins a bishop on the spot. This has happened in a number of games, even at top level, in some blitz games. I think there was an Aronian game, in fact, where he might have even fallen for this or something similar. So, you know, be careful. So after c6, what I actually would like to recommend is the move knight d2. Again, quite a flexible move. We can always take on f6, but the thing is that here, after e takes f6, e3, d5, we actually transpose again to one of the two d5 lines. So I actually like knight d2, keeping the pieces on, and I've done some work on this position. And if here black, of course, he can play d5, but he could. The critical move really is queen b6. If he does play d5, naturally moves like e3 followed by bishop d3, and either f4, knight gf3, even knight e2 sometimes to bring the other knight round to f3 are fine. And we get one of those stand positions. I think we'll see a few more of those a bit later on, those kinds of structures. But for now, queen b6 is a really critical move, because, you know, black threatens 2 pawns. And here, I actually think the move, there are 2 very interesting moves here. But the move e4 is really in the spirit of the opening. The point is that white ignores the fact that black can take a pawn, and in exchange for the sacrifice, we get really rapid development. And in the Trompowsky, especially in lines, the main lines with knight e4 or even 2c5, we see that white doesn't mind giving up material if he can get that initiative via rapid development. And here, for example, if queen takes d4, white can just play c3, and after the queen retreats, e5. So we're hitting the black pieces very quickly. And if knight d5, we can play knight gf3, and if queen takes b2, well, that's actually a huge blunder, because now knight c4. So black hasn't won 2 pawns. In fact, after queen takes c3 check, he hasn't won 3 pawns, because bishop d2 traps the queen. So that's a really nice little idea. So after knight gf3, black can't do that, and notice how it's very difficult for him to get his pieces out. He doesn't ever want to go e6 because of this d6 square. White is following up with knight c4, bishop d3, queen e2 very quickly, and a huge initiative actually. And this is very unpleasant for black to play. The concept, though, the key idea here, and I'll reiterate this throughout this series, is that we have to develop really quickly to take advantage of our lack of material or material imbalance. And here's a perfect example of that. So I think that's really an interesting line after queen b6. to play e4. Of course, queen takes b2 is also possible in this position, but again, black has to be very, very careful about the move knight gf3. Simply developing with tempo, attacking, rather defending the d4 pawn, and once again threatening this knight c4, bishop d2 idea. And if the queen comes back to b6, well, again, you know, we've got this e5 move in the air, and we're hitting the black pieces all over the place. Really not pleasant to play for him at all over the board. So c6, knight d2, and well, I would say that the majority of players are going to play something a bit more traditional here. d5 really must be the main move. So just keep your eyes out for the chapter on 2d5 for those kinds of positions. Another move on move 2 is to play the move d6, which is not a bad move actually, because if white plays knight c3 here, I actually am willing to give that. Dubious might be a bit too much, but I don't think it's the most accurate move. And the reason is because here, black gets a chance to play knight bd7. And after e4, e5, we actually get a version of the Philidor defense, which happens after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, that position. And the bishop just doesn't ever belong on g5 in these games. And here, I really am not a massive fan of this setup for white whatsoever. So after d6 on move 2, I am actually quite happy with white taking on f6 straight away. And the point is that here, after e takes f6, e3, f5, g3, g6, we actually transpose to one of the main lines of the 2g6 variation, which is something that I'm going to be covering in the next chapter for the slightly more frequent second moves, although not the, let's say, traditionally accepted main lines in inverted commas. So we'll see more of this variation in the next clips. So apart from that, well, here there's not really much else that makes too much sense. I hope this clip has been of use. Again, a lot of these unusual second moves aren't played for a reason, and that's because, well, white should be fine, at least have a small edge in most of these variations, and a lot of them, as I've mentioned throughout this clip, do transpose to some of the more recognized lines in this opening, so we'll cover those now. Hope you've learnt a lot, and please now go and check out the rest of the clips in this series.
Hi, this is Grandmaster Damian Lemos. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, The 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from onlinechesslessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for onlinechesslessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.